Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It's Monday, October 14th. Derek VanRiper, Eno Sarris here, back with you. On this episode, we take a look at some of the keys to the LCS matchups. Of course, the NLCS got underway this weekend. We did not have a schedule that allowed us to record any episodes before the start of the series. We'll just break down the series as a whole, though, as a part of today's show. A lot of drama on Saturday as well, as the Guardians eliminated the Tigers. We'll talk about what's next for both the Tigers and the Padres, we said goodbye to in recent days. Eno, how's it going for you on this Monday?
It's good. I'm back from Fresno. That was for my in-laws' 50th wedding anniversary.
Awesome. Congrats to them. 50 is a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that as a guy who's reached 15 in that facet of life and just 40 in general. So
Yeah.
50 together is it's a lifetime. So congrats to them on that milestone. If you would like to join our Discord, highly recommend it for at least two reasons. One, good people, good baseball chatter. Two, puppies. SLGS Reds just got a new puppy named Bear in the Pets channel. Check out Bear. Bear's awesome. So on to the baseball. Will the Dodgers ever give up a run again? You know, they now have set a postseason record, 33 consecutive innings without allowing a run. That goes all the way back to the 6-run inning that the Padres had the last time the Padres scored in that series. Like, if you had told anybody in that moment, while Twitter was beginning to write the obituary for the 2024 Dodgers, that the Padres were going to stop scoring and the Dodgers were going to stop giving up runs, nobody, absolutely nobody would have bought into the idea that they'd go on a streak like this.
Yeah, and it's going to leave for some soul searching in San Diego. But I think it's a little bit that, you know, guys like Evan Phillips and Alex Vesia and Michael Kopech and Blake Trinan are actually really good relievers. And also that a really good lineup can have a couple games where it doesn't click. I don't know that there's any sort of science to this, that there's any great mistake that the Padres made. I think it's just the Dodgers kind of did that postseason bullpen roulette, you know, where they kind of sorted through their options and they actually found that they're probably 4 to 6 guys deep in the bullpen when people maybe didn't give them that credit. And 4 to 6 guys in the bullpen, 2 starters, you know, people have won championships with that kind of a pitching staff. So, I think the work in San Diego over the offseason is to just be as good as they were last year again.
The question, I guess, is how do you do it? AJ Preller and that front office have been very creative, very opportunistic when players become available. I think that suits them well, right? They don't have a lot in concrete as far as like their long-term plans. They can change pretty quickly. I think what's different now for San Diego since the passing of Peter Seidler, their owner, and having a TV situation that's been messy, is that now that they're in this boat, they're trying to stay under the luxury tax threshold. While Peter Seidler was still alive, that wasn't a concern. So that's sort of the upper end bound, right? They were at $231 million for the competitive balanced tax 40-man breakdown going to the season. The threshold for the luxury tax was 237. So that was clearly important to them. If you like the opening day payroll at COTS instead, they dropped down to 14th at $164 million on the opening day payroll. So they live closer to the middle of the pack league-wide, which is still, for as small of a market as they are, a nice payroll, but it's also less than they were spending just a couple of years ago. The key free agents, Jurickson Profar just gave them a great season in 2024, did that as a $1 million player, a very, very late signing that was huge. I mean, it's everything and more you could ask from Profar for this year. Tanner Scott, who they acquired midseason, Kyle Higashioka, Martin Perez, David Peralta, and then Ha-Seong Kim has a mutual option that everyone expects him to decline, even though he's going to miss some part of April following shoulder surgery. But for the most part, the roster is still intact. I think the question comes down to how much can they wiggle onto the roster financially? Like they have to create some space, most likely, if they're going to make any sort of massive signings. So maybe it's more like 2 or 3 moves to get to one big addition in the end.
Yeah. Now, over at Fangraphs, in the payroll section of Roster Resource, they have arbitration estimates in. And so you can pretty easily see that their luxury tax number for 2025 is already 231 million with the cap at 237. So they are going to have, $2-3 million to spend on maybe a backup catcher, a reliever, and a Profar Solano Peralta type. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some sort of trade to kind of shed some money. But, they're either really long-term contracts that have a lot of money in them, or they're players that are useful and they want to keep. So the biggest way that they could shed some money is Yuki Matsui, maybe, who still is due something like $16 million. I think that's movable, maybe. But that doesn't open up a lot for them. If they got him off the team, it would just give them more room to maybe re-sign Profar. I don't think he's going to get a ton of money given his age and his history. And get a backup catcher. I know Higashioka had become the starting catcher, but I don't think you have starting catcher money anymore. So it's going to be Luis Campusano again, I believe. They have a lot of good team. They have a lot of good players on this team. They're bringing most of the team back. So I think it's both good and bad news that they won't have a lot of money to do stuff. They're just going to re-rack it and say, try again.
The tricky thing, though, too, is you try and imagine different trade routes they can go down. Is they got Leo DeVries, one of the top prospects in baseball, is easily their best prospect. Kind of seems more like a guy you're waiting on contributing as opposed to flipping in a blockbuster. You can't rule anything out with AJ Preller, but in my mind, he's just more in the guy that's so good that he doesn't get traded as a prospect level. Ethan Sarris, who is coming off of a season where the stock has come down a little bit, but we're still talking about a player who was 18 at high A this year. So defensively looks like a big league catcher already. And it's just a question of when the bat comes around, maybe Sarris could get traded. Won't bring back as much today as he would have brought back last offseason. The depth behind that is where there's questions. Like they don't necessarily have that next obvious wave of great players to deal from, but they're very good at replenishing the system. That's one of the strengths in the AJ Preller era: scouting, signing players, finding players, drafting, everything, like across the board, right? They replenish generally as well. It's just about any team out there, but it looks like a slight down cycle as far as what they currently have in the cupboard. So yeah, maybe it is working a little bit more off of the big league roster. The bigger long-term deals, they're not crazy expensive on an AAV basis, right? You're not spending a lot every year on Bogarts and Machado, relatively speaking, but I think those contracts are always tricky to move because you're at the point now where even if you still think Machado is a 4 or 5 win player, he's post-peak. So it's going to be a gradual decline. Bogarts, you've talked about many times being a guy that of those big contracts, you probably wouldn't have given him that money in the first place. He's probably even more difficult to sign because the performance baseline is lower than Machado's. But at least like Tatis, for example, he's signed for a long time. He's not going to get a lot more expensive right away. So they do have this core in place for a while because they added Cease, because they added King. They still have a good 1-2 with Darvish. The Joe Musgrove injury is going to carry over. They're going to have to find a back-end starter, but their needs are actually not that bad because of some of the players they acquired still being a part of the roster in 2025.
Yeah. I could see them trading Ethan Salas, actually. Because in terms of catching depth, like Luis Campusano has at least proven that I think he's at least proven that he can play catcher at the major league level. right? So he represents depth. So even if he's not a starter, and if Ethan Salas is not a starter, and you don't think Luis Campusano is a starter, then Ethan Salas can maybe get you a starter. I'm looking at Ryan Jeffers, and the only reason I'm looking at Ryan Jeffers is that the Twins are possibly up. I think they're up for sale, and it's not obvious which way they're going. So at least you want to reach out to somebody like the Twins and be like, what are you thinking about, and maybe getting Ryan Jeffers, maybe unloading Yuki Matsu, maybe some sort of creative accounting, or maybe getting a reliever from the Twins along with a Ryan Jeffers for Ethan Salas and something might make sense. Otherwise, trading for a catcher is rough business. Most teams jealously guard their catching depth because it's such a tough position.
I'm still looking at Campusano and thinking, yeah, he might hit enough to be a good big league player, but the catching numbers were awful this year. I know he was banged up at times too, but you're talking at or near the bottom of the league in framing, blocking, just everything you're looking at for defensive value grades him out poorly at the moment. So I wonder if that's the sign that they've moved on from Campusano as their fallback option, because he's not hitting enough at all to justify defense that bad, and the carryover effect is massive.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the market will be for Higashioka. He's coming off his best season offensively. Still hasn't put up a 2-WAR season. I would suggest that the best option for the Padres is to probably re-sign Kyle Higashioka. But once you do that, I think you have to make another trade somewhere to cut cash.
Yeah, and this is a guy that is going to be 35 in April. I think the market will look at him as a short-term 1-year catcher, so perhaps they can get him $3-4 million and make that actually fit within the framework of their plan. But overall,
it'll be really tight. They give him $4 million, and by Fangraphs numbers, they're at 235 under a 237 cap. So they're going to be calling people to see if anybody can take money off their books.
Yeah, well, they have the right GM to actively shop anyone and everyone to make it happen. As far as the NLCS matchup goes, though, we're looking at this Dodgers-Mets series. Game 1 happened on Sunday. The Dodgers win on a blowout. Kodai Senga just didn't have it for a simple explanation. It was worse than that, though. The Dodgers piled on 9 runs. The carryover effect I wondered about for the series is kind of a bigger picture question anyway. They used Reed Garrett for 1 1/3. He should be fine to come back and pitch in Game 2. David Peterson came in for bulk. That was probably expected all along. Danny Young chewed up a few outs for them. Budo threw a lot, so he threw 43 pitches. So you're probably not going to see Budo in Game 2. But mostly the guys they would need available pitching-wise in Game 2 are all there for the Mets. But the gift, I think, that the Dodgers received was that the Mets couldn't really get anything going against Jack Flaherty. 7 scoreless, 2 hits, 6 Ks, 2 walks. That was a great performance from Flaherty. And that shifted the Dodgers from putting Walker Buehler out there, which I think is it's a door being opened with Buehler being in his current form, to the bullpen game. And I think the more we start thinking about the Dodgers bullpen games in the postseason, the more we continue to warm up to the idea of, hey, that's probably just as nasty, if not more nasty, than getting a average number 3 starter at this point.
Yeah, I think I had the stat that they had 15 guys with above average stuff during the regular season in the bullpen. And with those 4 that I mentioned earlier, in Kopech, Trinan, Phillips, and Vesia, although is Vesia hurt?
Yeah, Vesia is hurt, so he's not on the roster for the NLCS.
Ribs. That's a little bit of a problem because he's just a really good lefty, and that moves Anthony Banda up a little bit. But I think if sort of like Banda, Brazier, and Hudson are the soft parts of your bullpen game, they're probably, equal to the soft parts of the Mets bullpen after a starter has started. Hudson, Banda, and Brazier, versus on the Mets, I guess, because I guess Diaz, Budo, and Garrett are kind of the final 3. So you'd be putting those 3 Dodgers up against Matone, Megill, and Young, and probably take the Dodgers 3.
Yeah. The other wrinkle, I guess, is that Brent Honeywell is on the roster. The regular season strikeout rate was really low, like 12.1% low. But because he throws a screwball, I saw in our Discord, it was Grant, I believe, who was pointing out that that's basically like having a lefty just because of what that pitch does to lefties, which is kind of interesting. You don't think of him as a matchup play that way, but maybe Honeywell is used as sort of an early option if they run into a left-handed chunk of that Mets lineup and want to just do something a little bit different.
Yeah, I have no idea where this is being picked up in the Stuff Plus. Because Stuff Plus loves his changeup. And I wonder if that's what they're thinking the screwball is. We don't have a designation that comes over from StatCast that says screwball. But
I think we need one. Got to get Mike Petriello on the horn.
I do love his stuff, and I did get to talk to him a little bit during the regular season. He said that the Dodgers were really helping him dial in the screwball. Oh, there it is. It's listed as a screwball over there. Maybe it just doesn't come through on Fangraphs. Looks like a changeup in the data for sure. I think what's funny is that on Baseball Savant they have like sort of average movement for that pitch type, and I'm pretty sure he's the only screwball in there, so his movement is pretty lined up with the average movement for a screwball.
Question for you that I saw kicking around on The Athletic earlier today. What do you make of the Mets bullpen matchup options against Shohei Ohtani? Do you think that is a particularly weak spot for the Mets? I mean, matching up with Ohtani's tough anyway, but if you don't have a power lefty, does that leave you extra vulnerable to one of the league's elite hitters?
I mean, it'd be nice. I think that they'll have to push Manaea. It'd be nice to have a lefty starter here, and they'll have to push. I think I agree with you that they'll push Manaea that third time through, at least for Ohtani, and then maybe take him out for Betts or whatever. But that is a bit of a weakness for that bullpen. And, we saw the Tigers, I think, do pretty well with their relieving crew, partially because they had a bunch of lefties in there, or at least a couple lefties that they could use. So for the Mets, I think that's a little bit of a soft part of their belly. And then just generally, I kind of only trust three relievers in that Mets bullpen. I like Budo, I like Edwin Diaz, and I like Reed Garrett. Beyond that, there's some real questions. I think with Stanek, it's always been, is the command there? With Maton, I think it's just okay stuff. And I don't, Ottavino's got that great breaking ball, but they obviously don't trust him very much. And the rest are converted starters, which, that can always work out really well, or they're not suited for it or whatever it is. But the converted starters are also guys that I have questions about. Like Megill, I think, could be really key for them because he's so velocity dependent in how good he is. So if he's coming out of the pen and throwing 97s and 98s, for 2 innings, like that could be really, really big for them, even if he's not necessarily a lefty. At least it's a bridge reliever that has some power stuff.
Yeah, that's true. That could end up being a difference maker too. I think the hard thing about
maybe you'll see Peterson again because of what you're talking about.
I think we'll see Peterson, after the off day in game 3 potentially, just because of need. I wonder if part of the script, you have an off day after Monday's game 2. You're hoping to go back to New York with a split and then have a chance to maybe win 3 at home and close it out, but at least just keep it alive, like keep it to the point where it has to go back to Los Angeles if you don't take care of business at home in the Mets predicament. But the way I'm looking at this team is I'm wondering if we're going to see all the flaws we've talked about, the Tigers pitching strategy. If the longer the series goes, the more your depth gets tested. And I think that's where the Mets were getting away with some things that it will be harder to get away with going forward. I think if Manaea can give them 5 and change, get through Ohtani that third time, that bodes really well. They could probably use Garrett for another inning, even though he pitched in game 1. Maybe you have to hide one of Stanek or Phil Maton if it's like 5 1/3. Like one of those guys comes in and cleans up, and you can probably get 2 from Diaz because Diaz didn't pitch in game 1, and you got the off day. So you can push a few of your A relievers a little harder, but it's going to come down to the effectiveness of Minaya against that Dodgers lineup. That's going to be a critically important stretch for them.
The stuff that you're talking about is possible in game 2, but you also said, you're looking to win a lot of those games at home if you're the Mets, after you lose this first game. And that's where it gets hard to pull a lot of those shenanigans because you got 3 games in a row.
Right. That's the other part of the schedule.
Yep. Edwin Diaz 6 innings in 3 days. You know what I mean?
So the command would be pretty bad by that last day.
Yeah, and what it means is that somebody has to step forward for the Mets, in those games. And maybe it's Miguel more in a starter type capacity because he actually has to go 5 because it's the middle game of a 3-game series and they used all their relievers in the first game.
Right. That'd probably be sometime around game 4, I think, the way things are tracking right now, right? Because we'd see Luis Severino get the ball in game 3 when the series shifts back to New York. But yeah, it's tough, especially the morning after a blowout loss, to sit here and say, okay, no, they're fine. Look, they've taken their share of punches. They've come out of a few different situations over the course of the regular season to get into the playoffs, and even in the playoffs that a lot of other teams wouldn't have come through. So they could be fine. But I do think we're starting to see why the Dodgers were a postseason favorite. That's been on display for these last few days in a way that it had not been previously on display in the first part of that series against the Padres.
Yeah, the Mets have to, if they can, get on the trajectory or whatever it is, and just try to get at bats against the Dodgers relievers before the game. You know what I mean? They just have to simulate it somehow, because that's the most difficult thing about a bullpen game is you're just like, damn, this guy's totally different than the last thing. Nothing that I learned in my last at bat helps me in this one. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You agree with this approach, though, for the Dodgers, right? They're making the right choice not using Buehler.
Well, I mean, they're going to have to use Buehler eventually, and they might even use him in this game. But I think branding it as a bullpen game makes sense, especially because of what I just said about the 3-game series.
Right? Yes, you could delay him to the part of the schedule that's trickier, because running too many relievers out there 3 consecutive days is a really slippery proposition.
And maybe, you can. Then you'll play with the Yamamoto Buehler, toggle in games 3 and 4, because you I think you want to pitch the guy you think will go deeper first. Yeah. So you can use fewer relievers in that first game.
I think you do, because you want to have as many available for the back-to-back before the off day as possible. And by doing it in a way where Yamamoto goes in game 3, he's on regular rest if the series goes 7.
Yeah.
That's the other calculus that I think you want to account for.
Yeah, and then you're hoping Buehler, in the second game gives you at least 4, so that you're not, maybe you don't have to go to multiple innings on all your best relievers, So, yeah, I think they're playing it right. For the Mets, yeah, it's just gonna have to break through. You're gonna have to break through against relievers. You're gonna have to do something against their reliever core. And I think for training, a lot of times it's just patience. I think sometimes you got to wait him out. He doesn't have the best, he has okay command, but it's better than trying to really do some damage against that super sinker and slider combo, And then I guess maybe a lefty could do something to train in, because that's not the greatest movement combo for training to go against a lefty. Same thing with Phillips. So we're circling Francisco Lindor, from the left side. We're circling we're circling Brandon Nimmo.
Yeah, and he's playing with plantar fasciitis right now. We learned he's been dealing with that off and on for a while, but sounds like it's more of a problem when he's running than anything else.
Yeah, so those 2 guys need to do some damage, because with Vesia hurt, they're going to get Banda, or they might actually get in a bat against Phillips or Treinen, and their bat pass, their front hitting from the left side is going to make it a little bit harder on those righties.
One other Dodgers random note that I saw, it doesn't have anything to do with the series. Gavin Stone likely to miss 2025 after shoulder surgery, if you're just keeping tabs on their depth and the future. So
that sucked, man. His fastball was just getting better and better, and he really looked like a good young player. I wonder. So in the minor leagues, the Dodgers throw the hardest.
Hmm.
And it is a little concerning to put that fact together with all these injuries. And you'd wonder if maybe this is too early, too much stress too early on their prospects, or if it's too much of a emphasis on velocity, or what it is. I mean, velocity is good. Nobody's arguing against that. But the losing Dustin May, River Ryan, and Gavin Stone to full year injuries, and I haven't even mentioned all of them. I'm just mentioning the ones I like the best, in terms of the youngest pitchers. I mean, right after they lost Emmett Sheehan for a year. I mean, it just seems like there's a bit of a problem here, maybe.
Yeah, and I think Andrew Friedman's even referred to this as something they want to try and change. They're going to change something in their approach. We'll see what that actually is over the course of time. But yet another injury on the ledger for the Dodgers pitching staff. Let's move over to the ALCS. How about Lane Thomas hitting a grand slam off Tarek Skubal to push the Guardians into the ALCS? It wasn't quite the low-scoring game you and I thought it was going to be that sent the Guardians through. And I think if you said the Tigers are going to match up with the Guardians and Tarek Skubal is going to take the ball, I think 10 times out of 10 we'd back the Skubal side. That's the preferred matchup of the two, and knowing that Skubal also pitches deep into starts, whereas other teams are yanking starters a bit earlier. All that is to say, Lane Thomas hits the biggest home run of his career, and that was the bulk of the damage in a 7-3 win in Game 5 of the ALDS. I noticed that Cade Smith had 11 swinging strikes in his 1 2/3 innings in Game 5. That is absolutely absurd out of the bullpen. But just thinking about this Guardians team for a moment, and I think everyone's going to look at them and say clear underdogs against the Yankees, and I would agree with the assessment. They are an underdog. I don't think it's that much of a stretch for them to hang around, and I say that even as someone that's been skeptical of them all year. I think what they can do is they can match up a lot of different relievers that the Yankees haven't seen a ton, and at least create some situations that are going to make those hitters uncomfortable. So I don't know. Like I've been skeptical all year, but some of the weaknesses in the back of the rotation matter less. And depending on how the first 2 games of the series go, I think that's going to be a huge, huge thing. Like if you told me the Guardians are going to lose the first 2, I would have a lot of questions about them rallying back because of the format and having the 3 consecutive days and the importance of their bullpen. But if they can just get a split in the Bronx to get things started, sure. Why couldn't they hang around and possibly win this series?
Yeah, I would assume that, you're going to have at least 2 bullpen games for these guys in the playoffs.
Are you counting Alex Cobb starts as bullpen games?
I mean, even Boyd just went 2 in the last one.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to know where you're drawing that line, but I think you just try to be a little bit careful with those bullpen games, and so maybe Boyd starts game 2, and that's heavy relief appearance because there's always the travel day after game 2. Then I guess Cobb would start game 3 because they've allowed him to go deeper, and he's been pretty efficient. And then we're going to finally see Gavin Williams, I think.
At some point in the middle chunk of the series, Gavin Williams will have to throw. They're going to go Cobb in game 1 against Rodon. So it's Cobb and then Bybee before the break. So I think you see a lot of relief.
That's the hard part thing?
I think it's just the regular rest. That's just the way everyone lines up. And then I think the difference
not
would be
for them. They'd probably rather have the Boyd second and Bybee first.
Yeah, you'd rather have Cobb or Boyd going in game 2 than game 1 because of how you use your bullpen and you want that break. Yeah. Because you don't have that, I wonder if that means the door is open for Boyd in his mid-series start, I'm assuming game 3, to actually go deeper the way he did the first time around against the Tigers, right? I think where they were in that series probably dictated usage a little bit more, and trying to save relievers as much as you can in game 3, series conditions, permitting, is probably a thing you'd like to do if you're in Stephen Vogt's position.
Yeah, Boyd, it's a really interesting case for Stuff Plus because they never liked him. But let's say you give him, 8 points of Stuff Plus because he's a lefty, and people don't see him sleeve lefties that often, and that and this and that and the other, and you still he'd still have bad stuff if you gave him 8 points of stuff. And yet there's been these times where he's had really great strikeout rates. And to some extent, I think it's just a willingness to just continue throwing a lot of sliders. But this year, it's not been really that heavy on the sliders. So I don't really have an explanation for it. I guess the change is good, or maybe we're not capturing something that's unique about his arm angle. I don't really know how he gets so many strikeouts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised his four-seamer doesn't get hit more because of being at the lower end of the velocity range at 92. So that's kind of part of it too. Maybe there's something about the fastball they don't see really well. It's a deep arsenal. There's a few things he does well enough that seem to work for Matthew Boyd. But I think his innings end up being really important for the Guardians in this series because that can help take some of the wear and tear off of their A relievers, keep that group as effective as possible, and probably keep these games very low scoring, right?
Somebody from that Boyd, Cobb, Gavin Williams group has to step forward and kind of pitch a masterpiece type deal. Like somebody has to step forward and go a little deep into games, or else they're gonna be really testing their bullpen depth, I think.
Even like 4 innings of 1-run ball from one of those guys would be a pretty big lift at some point in the series. Is it fair to say if these games turn into a slugfest that heavily favors the Yankees, even though we've discussed the Guardians lineup as one that has more power than we've seen in the past? They were league average during the regular season, took kind of a different way to get there, showed more pop in the first half than they did in the second half. But generally, a lower scoring game is probably going to suit them a lot better than a slugfest.
Yeah. Surprisingly, the Guardians have a higher ISO than the Yankees, but neither is very good right now. That's surprising. I would say going forward, yes, the Yankees, this is a postseason ISO that I'm talking about. They're both at basically 120. And weirdly, the Yankees are making more contact than the Guardians. But in any case, it should be more about stringing together singles and timely hitting for the Guardians, and more about walks and slugging for the Yankees, who've walked almost twice as much as anybody else in the postseason. They've been really patient, and that'll test, I think, Cleveland too, because there are some guys in that pen that do well that don't have great command. I think of Sobrowski as in particular, and then Boyd is sort of willing to walk you as well. So depending on what these what the plan of attack is at the plate, they could just put a bunch of people on for that eventual Stanton Volpe blast that I'm looking for. Volpe, by the way, is swinging 4 miles an hour harder. He's swinging the bat 4 miles an hour harder in the postseason. So that's going to be my harbinger right there for the Volpe 3-run homer that turns one of these games.
That's going to be parlayed into the Volpe post-hype breakout in 2025 campaign. Like I could see that one metric, that one nugget carrying a lot of weight over the next few months. Anthony Rizzo back on the roster for the Yankees. I mean, we'll see if he's actually more than a bench bat at this point, just coming off the injury. I think his usage will be kind of interesting to watch. But yeah, the script that the Guardians were using against the Tigers, pitching wise, is probably their ideal script against the Yankees. It's just a question of diminishing returns as the Yankees' big bats in particular get more and more looks at some of those guys. They don't have a pitcher on the Guardians roster who's had the kind of success that Michael Wacha's had against Judge. We talked about that in the last round. I was trying to see if there's anybody that could sneak in there that has just done really, really well in that spot. No. Such a player does not exist. So I think that could be a good sign for Aaron Judge to maybe get a little bit more going in this series as well.
Yeah, I'm looking for I'm never gonna find it. There was a cool sort of mini deep dive into the Snell decision, taking Snell out for the third time through the order, and this analyst that I was reading found all the Snells before and then saw how they did in the next inning, the ones that were left in, the other Snells, 5 innings, 1 run, whatever it was. And they had like a collective 4.2 ERA or something in the next inning, no matter the fact that they were dealing or whatever. So I hate to say that, maybe leaving Skubal in wasn't the right choice. I know it's Skubal, and I know you're going to live and ride with your ace, and I know that bullpen was taxed in Detroit, but given the fact that they live analytically and do these kind of matchup things, it's a little surprising they left him in. I mean, you just go from he's dealing to grand slam in what seemed like seconds.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that gets second guessed when your season turns on a note like that. Who the pitchers in the bullpen are, how much they've been worked recently, those are all the factors you'd want to consider. And I imagine the Tigers went through the different scenarios that could have come up. And knowing how effective Lane Thomas has been in his career against lefties, you've definitely thought, okay, if he comes up in a spot with runners on base and it's the 5th inning, 6th inning, it's that window where you could go to the pen. Do you flip that switch, or do you say we let Skubal see him the 3rd time? And I think they probably had mapped that out far enough and said our relievers at this point are going to be seeing these hitters for maybe the 3rd or 4th time in the series, and that's not what we want to do. So we're going to roll the dice, and it didn't work. Like it's one of those things. You're trusting the best pitcher in the American League this season in a spot that mathematically is maybe a coin flip, and sometimes you're going to lose a coin flip, right? I think that's probably what happened in that instance. It is interesting to see how much that math favored taking Snell out, but I think the more than the who's like is he dealing question, which is very, very nebulous, it's what are the alternatives and how good are they, and what other situations are we going to be in as a result of going down the other path? That I think has to be calculated in too.
Yeah. I think that it behooves the Tigers to put themselves in a position where they have more options going forward, and they have more depth, so that they can still do their reliever mixing and matching, but behind a guy who went 4 or 5 innings, as opposed to doing it for a full game or whatever. So I think that looks like they have maybe 35 million that they can spend just to get to the luxury tax payroll for 2024. So if they've got $30 million that they can spend, and they're not really losing anything off of what they used in the playoffs, right? They're losing Jack Flaherty, quote unquote, I think that the things that I would put on the table for them is starting pitching depth. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be the very top of the market, but it has to be somebody that you think could at least get you 4 innings in the postseason, and in a postseason start. And then they've said a right-handed power bat. I do think, finding some way to use free agency to augment the lineup is important. And the right-handed power bat was a comment that they've already made. I forget who had media availability today, but they were talking about that. They also said that Javier Baez will have a role with the team. That is the way that's worded. It could mean that he's just a utility guy. And I know he's a $25 million utility guy, but I do think he probably has some value on a roster. And if that's sunk money, then the question is just whether or not he's better than the other options you have,
Right. You have to push yourself past the contract now. If you're a Tigers fan and you're evaluating Javier Baez, is he good enough to be one of our 4 bench guys? Can he play multiple infield positions? Yeah. Can he situationally have some value?
Right-handed power off the bench, can play anywhere.
The other way to word it is, if they released him and ate all the money, would some other team pick him up for the league minimum? Yeah, some other team would take the chance to pick him up as a bench guy. There are worse bench players in the league than Javier Baez. And because they don't have a lot of expensive players elsewhere on the roster, that mistake doesn't matter. The bigger question with the Tigers is kind of an unknown, at least right now. They were top 5 in payroll from 2012 to 2017, right? And those were the later years of Mike Ilitch owning the team. When he passed away in 2017, his son Christopher assumed control of the team, but the payroll dropped immediately after that
But that was
2017
also
season.
kind of going into a rebuild phase. So are they going to
Yeah,
maybe rebuild the payroll too?
you're right. The circumstances lined up in a way where they were going to rebuild, and dad passed away. So like there's like the question of will the son want to spend the money? Like always a question with ownership changes like this. I would probably split the difference between the higher end payrolls we saw in the early part of the last decade versus, some of the things we've seen more recently. If they're close, what if they're similar to the Padres in spending? 160, 165 million on the opening day payroll, no interest in going into the luxury tax. That seems like a reasonable step forward right now. And then as that core continues to get better, 1, 2, 3 years down the road from now, we're going to have similar questions. Okay, are they going to be willing to really like push it all in and actually pay the luxury tax to be a perennial winner, to be a perennial contender? Because I think this is a solid core. I mean, I think we would have looked at this team, even if they hadn't made the playoffs, and said, sure, they could be a playoff team in 2025. So the fact that they went on this run only increases the appetite for the fan base. Maybe it gives you more confidence building this roster that you've done a lot of things right. And it's for as much as we've made comparisons that they've built something that looks a lot like the recent Giants teams. It makes sense. Scott Harris came from San Francisco, you're effectively platooning. It's a cheap way to be competitive while you're waiting to get through a rebuilding window. The difference for me is the quality of the system, right? We saw Jackson Jobe a little bit in the postseason. He's obviously going to have a bigger role in 2025. You've got this next wave of prospects, Max Clark, Bryce Rayner, Kevin McGonigal. They're not helping you next year necessarily, but they're really good prospects. So you've got another wave of talent.
And they could be closer than they first appear just with the modern approach to player development.
If opening day 2026 is a possibility for any combination of those guys, that's still really good, right? So maybe they don't help you next year, but they're either great players that could be part of a trade. I don't think they would trade Clark. Even Rayner seems like a long shot to get traded. But they got guys coming beyond what they already brought up. Colt Keith looked great in the second half with the bat, more than 20% better than league average from July 1st on. I think as we look at more and more rookie players, we're going to see some different windows for adjustments. You're going to see some guys like Churio make the adjustment in 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Some guys are going to take a half season. Some guys are going to take a full season. But I look at Colt Keith, and even though we didn't see great underlying power metrics, I think we saw enough to at least buy into scouting reports that point to 70 grade raw power. I could see him hitting 20 or 25 home runs next year and doing it with a good average and a good OBP. It's not hard to make that sort of leap. Parker Meadows was a different player once he came back from AAA. Riley Green keeps getting better. So you've got present big league core. You've got depth. You've got a manager that seems like a good fit. You've got room on your payroll. And, maybe it's just saying, let's go get a veteran reliever. We were kicking around an idea in the group chat over the weekend. Maybe Kenley Jansen's a Tiger for a year, just because there's some stability in the ninth inning, and you can keep using chaos in the bullpen otherwise. And it's an inexpensive ad because it's like a 1-year deal, and you're not spending future money that you'll need to keep paying to retain Skubal and to pay higher ARB salaries on your key core guys, right? So it's something like that with one or two other smaller moves that just continue to elevate this roster.
Yeah, I think I'm going to also maybe throw in Nick Pivetta and if not Teoscar Hernandez, which would be a kind of a fun addition. You're talking about right-handed power bat that can hit it out of any stadium. If that approach leaves Scott Harris cold, and he talks about controlling the zone. He's a big control the zone guy. Maybe you just assign sort of, a veteran Justin Turner, JD Martinez type, for a cheap deal.
He's super cheap.
But, if we're talking JD Martinez, Nick Pivetta and Kenley Jansen, I think you might be spending $30 million between the three of them, sort of like 6, 15, and 10, something like that. And you'd be back to where you were last year. You'd be building, you'd be adding, and none of those would be long-term deals. I think the longest term deal on any of those would be 3 years. So you wouldn't be getting yourself into financial trouble long term. You'd be patching up things that are important for the team, and I think you'd be adding some upside. Like somebody like Nick Pivetta has got some demonstrated results, but he's never pitched in a park like Comerica. Like he could really maybe enjoy it because home runs are like the big problem that he's had so far. So that's a little one man plan here.
If you were going to do that and add a DH, whether it's Teoscar or JD or anybody that really doesn't play the outfield at all, that means Kerry Carpenter is playing in the field because you want Kerry Carpenter's bat. So
I don't think he's so bad that he can't play corner outfield. I don't know.
I never had Kerry Carpenter in that bucket. Like you'd be willing to get
like
the
Lenciel Perez better defensively, and liked other guys better defensively. Not that he's like atrocious.
Yeah, and I'm just glancing at the metrics right now. I mean, 81st percentile in arm strength, so you could put him out in right. They got him even for outs above average. And he didn't play out there that much this year, but not awful, I think is a fair assessment. And again, people that watch the Tigers every day might have a more firm assessment of that. But I would say I don't think anything I have ever seen in Kerry Carpenter's defense is so bad that it takes DH bats away from them in free agency. Whereas, like we talked about the Royals before the weekend, their roster situation is such that I don't think you can fit Teoscar Hernandez on that roster because of Sal and Vinny Pasquantino. The other part of the question for the Tigers also is at first base with Spencer Torkelson. Where do you go from here?
I know. I was looking for right-handed power on the thing, and there are some first basemen like Rhys Hoskins and stuff. There's right-handed power that's going to be out there at first base. And then I was like, but they have a right-hander at first base to some extent. If the Tigers are going to get better, some of the young guys made a step forward. They need another step forward.
Right.
Colt Keith needs to be the good version of Colt Keith all year long, not just also the bad version, And Torkelson needs to find it. There's still another level in some of the young guys on this team, and Parker Meadows needs to do what he did in the second half all year long. So there's some of it's on the young guys to kind of be more consistent and take some of the flashes that they've shown and show it all the time.
Yeah. What do you think Jace Young's role is on this team, right? I mean, 91 games at AAA, got 34 with the big club as a late call-up. Didn't get to the power at all yet, but what I was just saying earlier about young players making the adjustments, maybe it takes him half a season or a couple of months, and he wasn't even getting huge volume. Like we're talking about 94 plate appearances over 34 games. It's very hard to find your footing against big league pitching when you're not just in the lineup every single day. So is Jace Young part of the everyday core on this roster next year, and how much can he improve and just how quickly?
I think, you put Young and McKinstry and Vierling and Sweeney and Baez, and you're putting them into the mix, and you're putting together equal parts veteran, utilitarian, baseline, above replacement, bring the floor up with some of the veterans. And, for Young and Sweeney, it's, if you hit your top ends, you're going to be the starter. So I don't think that anybody on this team, knowing their ethos, is expecting to be really anointed a position. Maybe Riley Green, maybe Parker Meadows because he plays center field. Everyone else knows that, if Kerry Carpenter can be subbed out the day after he hits, a 3-run homer off for Clase to win the game, then, we're all just part of a team here that they're going to use us how they're going to use us. So I think that just internally they'd be like, okay, it's Sweeney and Young for upside, and it's like Vierling, McKinstry, and Baez for, competence.
Are you penciling Jobe in as a member of the rotation to begin the season? Do we see enough from him? I know he had a couple injuries that cost him time. In fact, they were using him as a reliever in the postseason. Probably says a lot about the confidence they have in his ability, but it was 73 2/3 innings this year at AA, 2 starts at Toledo, spanning 9 innings, and then just 4 at the end of the regular season, plus the postseason stuff. So it wasn't a heavy workload, but you can look at 130 or 140 innings as a possibility for Jobe. So I would imagine you want most, if not all of those in your rotation.
Yeah, he's a 6th starter for me right now on the depth chart, just because, Kaider Montero, Brent Herter, and Casey Mize and Reese Olson have all shown something. It would seem like a shame to kind of take them out of the rotation. You know what I mean? You could maybe do a 6-man to try and keep all their innings down a little bit. Or I think the assumption here is not all 4 of the guys I just mentioned are going to make it, to opening day in one piece. It's just the reality of it. So I would kind of assume that Jobe is one of the 5 without wanting to tell you who I would take out. If I was pressed, I guess I would take Herder out and maybe make him a long reliever. That's sort of what he was. But Jobe by talent, it's a little bit like the question we just had about third and short, where it's like Jobe is the upside and Herder has proven that he can bring the floor up. So somewhere between those two, you feel okay about that spot. I still think it would make sense for them to see if they can sign a starter that is clearly better than the 4 I mentioned.
Yeah, I think Nick Pivetta is the Seth Lugo of the 2024 offseason as far as the number of teams that you will sign him to on the podcast. And then if you end up being right about everything falling into place for him, everything clicking, and hey, like it's going to pay off. I think the difference will be, I think there's still more believers in Nick Pivetta today than there were in Seth Lugo going
Which
into
is weird because he was a fine
offseason.
reliever. But I guess he had the added obstacle not only of maybe not having the very top end stuff that Pivetta has, but also just being a reliever last year as opposed to Pivetta coming from starting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was the concern, is the jump from Lugo going from 65 to 146 in a third innings in 22 to 23. People worrying that he couldn't be a workhorse this year. You get the 206 and 2/3 plus the playoff innings too. It's a massive, massive jump for Lugo. And I think you mentioned that was one of the concerns with the Royals. A lot of guys, at and far exceeding their career highs for workload, wondering if there's going to be some carryover effect on that. I wonder, do you think there's any concern with the bullpen usage of the Tigers in the second half? Guys getting worked that heavily, carrying that over into 2025. We think about this all the time with starters. We talk about it a lot less with relievers, but do you think that is something to keep a close eye on when 2025 begins for this team?
Yeah, I think that's another good reason to put somebody like Jansen in there. I mean, I would be circling Bo Brisky, who's had injury concerns in the past and had sort of varying usage this last year. Will Vest was used pretty aggressively, and Jason Foley. I mean, I think those guys throw hard, and you wouldn't be surprised if one of them goes down next year. So just adding Jansen to that bullpen to be there in case other guys regress. And then what you may get from Jansen is he starts going into his Kimbrel type seasons where he's your closer for the first couple months and always starting to lose the job at the end of the year. That's okay. A closer that gets you there, and then you're like, oh, by the way, we just called up a guy who throws 99 and has, an 87 mile an hour sweeper, and he's actually our closer. But thank you, Kenley.
Yeah, the tier B, tier C closers, that's the model. Just get us through the regular season. Be good enough in the regular season, then we'll use some other reliever instead for those spots when it matters the most. Also a strange twist within modern baseball. But yeah, all in all, things look pretty good with that Tigers core right now. And you could see some combination of the young guys that broke through this year getting better. You could see some improvements on the margins, getting this team kind of back to a similar level pretty easily in 2025, especially if the Twins are going to go through an ownership change and have a relatively quiet offseason. That would also leave the door open, because that was the team we liked the most in this division for most of the year, and they didn't even make the playoffs. And now there's a bit of a cloud of uncertainty hanging over them as this offseason approaches. We are going to go on our way out the door. A reminder, you can get a subscription to The Athletic for $2 a month for the first year at theathletic.com/rates and barrels. As I mentioned earlier, join our Discord. The link is in the show description. You can find Eno on Twitter at Eno Sarris. Find me at Derek VanRiper. Find the pod at Rates and Barrels. That's going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Tuesday.
Thanks for listening.